The National Council on Severe Autism, as run by its president, Jill Escher, says that it wants to ensure that the most isolated and disadvantaged autistic people remain part of the disability conversation. If the NCSA actually did that, and did only that, I personally would have no problem with them. But instead, they've proven themselves to be a morbid disgrace to disability advocacy, and unless they commit to significant fundamental reforms and issue elaborate, detailed apologies for their actions in the matters I'm about to discuss, the NCSA has no legitimacy in representing the interests and well-being of autistic people of any description, or voicing the concerns of the non-autistic friends, family, and professional caregivers of autistic people. The axis of my personal belief that the NCSA disrespects autistic people and is evil for doing so is their coverage of an online news article published by Transmitter Spectrum. The article features an interview with Dr. Jahil Javed, a clinically diagnosed autistic person working in the medical field, who founded a nonprofit to promote mental health among disabled people after her autistic support group partner took their life out of fear that they would never be accepted as a doctor by the non-disabled world. The Spectrum article contains this deceased autistic person's reproduced final message of despair, along with a termination letter issued to a different autistic doctor who was instantly fired upon discovery of their diagnosis by their superiors. The National Council on Severe Autism's president, Jill Escher, made this Spectrum article the focus of a feature-length NCSA podcast discussion in which she, in an explicitly deceptive manner, read only the first 9% of the article to her podcast audience. And then she led her NCSA podcast panelists in denouncing, mocking, and ridiculing the article and the autistic people featured in it for allegedly self-identifying as neurodivergent and claiming to be autistic. Also supposedly for pawning off their personality quirks as disabilities, and for censoring and erasing the struggles of so-called true autistic people, in a manner that NCSA board member Dr. Lee Wachtel of the Kennedy Krieger Institute went on to liken to anti-Semitic racism. To be clear, these NCSA published statements are explicitly in reaction to an article about professionally diagnosed autistic people, removing any debate for or against self-diagnosis from this discussion. And the autistic people in question certainly didn't use their appearance in the Spectrum article to deny or reject the struggles of others in the autistic community with higher support needs than their own. The fact that the NCSA has published separate messages describing the clinical diagnosis of high-functioning autism as also being a form of self-identification makes any concern the NCSA voices against autistic self-diagnosis highly questionable in terms of the sincerity of its intentions, and it seems to me that certain NCSA members would prefer all autistic people outside of those they consider severe cases to be erased from the history of autism and from the disability community. In serialized examples such as these, the National Council on Severe Autism has used their frustration with the clinical and academic acceptance of autism as a spectrum disorder that includes the so-called higher functioning as an excuse to present the mere existence of autistic people, other than those the NCSA grants privilege and sympathy to, as villainous disability impersonators with an organized agenda to make the lives of other autistic people miserable. My own status as an autistic self-advocate would cause some to consider me a biased extremist for saying that the NCSA is evil for doing this, which is fine by me. But what I think is biased and extreme is that the NCSA, an alleged autism advocacy group, has, through their own official channels, ridiculed and denounced the autistic colleagues of an autistic suicide victim and depicted those innocent people as falsely autistic disability appropriating extremists with personality disorders and a vicious bias against ASD3 autistic people who the NCSA describes as severe cases. The NCSA's president led this discussion in response to the harmless Spectrum News article after having insisted in a previous episode of her podcast that the ability for so-called high-functioning autistic people to be formally diagnosed with ASD1 is, in her own words, a violent absurdity against her own autistic children. This is no longer about putting a spotlight on those with the greatest disadvantages. This is about promoting disrespect for those whose disadvantages Jill thinks don't deserve to be seen as serious. And joining Jill on the podcast feature against the Spectrum News article were Dr. Carmen Lopez-Arvizu and NCSA board member Dr. Lee Wachtel, both of the Kennedy Krieger Institute, who used the article as an opportunity to falsely imply that high-functioning autistic people aren't legitimate in receiving disability services such as special education. And they discuss high-functioning autism itself not as though it were a description of a range of neurodevelopmental disability, but as though it were an insurgent political movement with membership on a voluntary basis that maintains official positions not only that autistic characteristics can't be disabling, but that the diagnoses of autistics that the NCSA considers lower functioning aren't real. I would certainly expect two doctors of leadership within a children's disability hospital like the Kennedy Krieger Institute to be better formed on autism than this. But for Dr. Wachtel and Dr. Arvizu, that's apparently too much to ask. The Spectrum article in question featured accounts of autistic people who, in their own words, felt permanently or internally broken after unexpectedly being clinically diagnosed with ASD. And Dr. Lee Wachtel decided it was suitable to react to this by complaining about people who were, in Lee's words, claiming to have autism and happily adopting the identity of autism and were doing a disservice to those with true forms of autism. True autism, by the way, is not a medically or academically recognized phrase, but Lee uses it in ways that cause end-level patients who would have been considered severely and clinically significantly impaired, even decades ago, to be treated as disability impersonators that are stealing services from real autistic people as part of a social media fad, and in Lee's phasing, as presented in certain NCSA presentations outside of this podcast, a woke political identity. In a different NCSA presentation, supposedly intended to highlight the needs of the highest support needs autistic people, Lee criticized the clinical recognition of ASD1, often known as high-functioning autism, by comparing it to a person being able to claim cancer and grade their own tumor based on their personal identity preference, which is not how the ASD1 diagnosis works at all. And Lee reacted to the Spectrum article, which, to remind you, contains the reproduced suicide note of one autistic person and the reproduced termination letter of another autistic person who was instantly fired for having an ASD diagnosis, by saying that she, in her words, got a chuckle out of it, the article. Not only does Lee represent the suffering of clinically diagnosed, high-functioning, as she'd put it, autistic people as amusing, she misrepresents attempts by autistic people to speak out against life-destroying societal stigma against autistic people as extremist identitarian nonsense from people she and her friends laughingly derided in that NCSA presentation as those children. These are adults we're talking about, by the way. And Lee then blames autistic self-advocates in general for disability trivializing merchandise very obviously aimed at the non-autistic parents of autistic children. Merchandise that contains messages that autistic self-advocates are overwhelmingly in contempt of. How someone like this could have a position of leadership in a childhood disability hospital is beyond me, but I could only assume that Lee is a fantastic doctor, at least to her own patients, who she isn't actively encouraging the public to disrespect by senselessly comparing them to anti-Semitic racists for speaking out against bias levied against them by people exactly like her. Speaking from the personal perspective of someone who, over 30 years back, benefited from disability supports and services within the scope of what Kennedy Krieger Institute offers outside of Dr. Lee Wachtel's inpatient neurobehavioral unit, I would hope that none of the children with autism and other disabilities currently served by Kennedy Krieger find themselves in the unfortunate position of growing up to attempt self-sustaining careers, only for those like KKI's own Dr. Arvizu and Dr. Wachtel to use the NCSA to publish complaints about them as well, as though the point of disability care and services was something other than alleviating people's suffering and, when possible, enabling them with the necessary support to overcome challenges and pursue fuller lives. The NCSA treated the Spectrum article as a hit piece against autistic people who the public might describe as lower functioning. In reality, the article contained no such messaging. It did feature accounts of challenges faced by autistic people who were interviewed, challenges that the NCSA's panelists refused to read or discuss on their podcast, before they then used that article as an example of neurodiversity proponents being non-disabled privileged crybabies who were concealing the challenges faced by autistic people. And it's true that within the NCSA podcast episode, Jill said she didn't deny the disability challenges of those like Dr. Javed who were discussed in the article. But moments later, after saying that, Jill laughed and joked that autistic doctors couldn't exist in real life. And she then proposed that high-functioning autistic people, like those in the article, be re-diagnosed with personality disorders, which in this context only a fool would treat as anything other than an attack on the character of autistic people unfavored by Jill and her pals. The fact that NCSA board member Lee Wachtel compared the publication of articles like the one they were discussing with anti-Semitism gives a clear idea of how the NCSA's leaders may feel about autistic people who they see as not suffering enough. If the NCSA's misrepresentation of the article was not bad enough, another NCSA board member has gone on their own personal social media account and falsely stated, with the implied authority of being some sort of gatekeeper for the disability community, that the diagnosis of autism was only valid as a disability in children, and that late-diagnosed autistic adults have no rightful place calling themselves disabled or accessing appropriate and relevant disability resources, which, as the Spectrum article so maligned by the NCSA explains, can include life-saving mental health support for autistic adults who are among the least impacted by disabling characteristics related to autism. Somehow, the Spectrum's mere mention of this fact was treated by the NCSA as bigoted organizing by bitter, falsely autistic partisans against their legitimately autistic family members. High-ranking NCSA members and a number of NCSA allies used their criticism of the DSM-5 diagnostic manual, issued in 2013, as an excuse to treat the ASD-1 diagnosis as though it were a non-scientific personal theory concocted by wannabe autistic online activists. And based on this falsehood, the NCSA, and examples like these, holds end-level ASD-1 patients in contempt for being formally diagnosed and calling themselves disabled, even though the people in question would have been officially considered to have severe and sustained clinically significant impairments by the textbook standards of over 30 years ago. Meanwhile, one of the NCSA's main complaints is that these people supposedly refuse to acknowledge ASD as a diagnosis of a disability. Consistent NCSA statements expressing frustration and distrust toward the ongoing recognition and visibility of ASD1 won't stop NCSA President Jill Escher from making exceptions for high-functioning ASD1 diagnosed autistic adult friends of hers, including some who are late diagnosed who Jill proudly features on the NCSA podcast as allies of her group and publishes their blog writings to the official NCSA website. And Jill's NCSA-hosted interview with her adult-diagnosed autistic friend who is loyal to the NCSA, Jill reassuringly smiled and nodded as this person discussed her plans to get a service dog. A service dog for a range of high-functioning autism that Jill and her allies consider a non-disability and other late-diagnosed autistic people. Jill encouraged her autistic NCSA allied friend to become a clinical psychologist and join the committee within the American Psychiatric Association that writes the DSM. But when Jahil Javed, an autistic psychiatric doctor, was featured in that Spectrum article for founding a mental health nonprofit after her autistic friend committed suicide, Jill laughed at that article and laughed at the mere idea of an autistic doctor on the basis that her own autistic children can't understand what a doctor is. If silly Jill Escher, who isn't even a doctor, wants to present herself as a forefront autism expert and disability advocate, she needs to realize that the legitimacy of people's neurodevelopmental disability status isn't a privilege that she's authorized to grant only to autistic people who she feels sympathetic for or who are loyal to the NCSA, while she, at the same time, derisively dismisses autistic adults outside of NCSA control as having what Jill calls TikTok autism. Autistic people merely providing an account of their own challenges and perspectives is too much for Jill if she considers these people too capable or successful compared to her own autistic children. Jill is entitled to her personal opinion, even a bigoted one, but the disability advocacy community deserves better than what Jill and her National Council on Severe Autism has proven themselves capable of offering. In my opinion, that's a shame, because I personally believe that the non-autistic caregiving parents of autistic people do have the right to organize, present their concerns, and share their perspectives, only for the NCSA under Jill Escher's leadership to proudly present the parents of high support needs autistic children as an opposing force to autistic people who organize on their own behalf in any way that non-autistic gatekeepers like Jill and her friends don't have total control over. Upon the NCSA's founding, Dr. Amy Lutz, who is now the NCSA's vice president, promised that her group would respect high-functioning autistic people who are organizing to pursue the support they needed. Whether Dr. Lutz sincerely meant that or not, the NCSA's prime leader, Jill Escher, has broken that promise and has broken the trust of any disabled person or non-disabled ally who agrees with me that the targeting of specified groups of disabled people for ridicule and exclusion for having less severe challenges than other disabled people is not acceptable. Any reasonable person would expect a nonprofit advocating for a specified subpopulation of a marginalized group would make it a key goal of theirs to fight discrimination. But instead, by acting in this way, Jill Escher and her NCSA podcast panelists and others are executing the textbook definition of discrimination and passing that off as advocacy. Focusing on the challenges faced by autistic people the NCSA describes as severe cases isn't an excuse that makes this okay. and many non-autistic caregivers and allies have specified their focus on autistic people with the highest support needs without maliciously targeting autistic people some may call higher functioning, and without encouraging them to be ridiculed and dismissed for discussing their own experiences with disability. The NCSA's lack of deservingness to receive support from the public and from the disability community is just my personal opinion. But what isn't my opinion is that Jill Escher deceptively presented an article that discusses the suicide of an autistic person and contains their reproduced final message of despair, and that Jill did this to present that deceased autistic person's friends as incorrectly describing themselves as autistic and conspiring to wage censorship and erasure against actual autistic people. And in case no one told you this, Jill, that's a big fucking no-no for someone who wants to run an autism advocacy nonprofit that solicits donations from the public based on the expectation that you'll use that money to help autistic people. And I say this to all members or supporters of the NCSA as a whole who were previously unaware of this situation concerning episode 39 of your organization's podcast and Jill's role within it. Every person belonging to or affiliated with the NCSA who thinks it might be fucked up that Jill used your organization to publicly ridicule the clinically diagnosed autistic friends of an autistic suicide victim because Jill didn't like the fact that these people were interviewed about their work to support their disabled colleagues and prevent additional suicides, and because Jill was upset by the fact that these autistic people were working as doctors, you need to get in contact with Jill right now and ask the president of your organization what the fuck her problem is and why her vendetta against autistic people who don't closely resemble her own children is so powerful that she's willing to pull evil stunts that serve to make the public disrespect disabled people who are fighting prejudice and lethal mental health crises that are plaguing their lives, just as absences of affordable specialized housing and years-long waiting lists for therapy and treatment and respite care shortages for distressed families are crises in the lives of your loved ones. Your support or lack thereof for the neurodiversity paradigm has nothing to do with the fact that Jill, who is your president, has used her position to do something absurdly spiteful that puts every good thing the NCSA may have achieved for high support needs autistic people in needless peril. Jill's actions are flushing your volunteer work hours down the toilet and burning your donated money as coal for the furnace of her personal hate train against lower support needs autistic people. A hate train where you've been denied even a window seat while she drives it into a wall at your expense. For her goal of publishing messages of a nature proven to cause autistic people that the NCSA describes as higher functioning to be targeted for harassment, threats, and derision in our communities, on and offline, in our schools, in our colleges, on our job sites, and that causes people not only to perceive us as disability impersonators wrongfully accessing support services we have relied upon for above and beyond 30 years, but also causes them to see us as the natural ideological enemies of so-called true autistic people. Autistic people who many outsiders, thanks to messages like Jill's, now believe that we hate, even though many of us grew up receiving disability support services alongside them and knowing them as our friends since childhood. And I will accept zero excuses or exceptions when I say the following. Unless you have personal stakes in terms of volunteered work hours or charitably donated money in the National Council on Severe Autism, or unless you've previously platformed the NCSA as a third party, or have hosted Jill as an esteemed guest on your show or an event of yours, unless you're such a person, no one watching my videos has any fucking business contacting Jill about any of this for any reason. If you're a neurodiversity proponent or an autistic self-advocate unconnected to the NCSA, and watching my videos makes you angry enough to want to contact Jill Escher to lambast her with your anger, if you cared that much, you would have been looking into this years ago. But you weren't. I was. Only me. If you go after Jill personally now, it shows that you only care about being seen taking action, because you weren't there looking into this. I was. And it's my personal intention not to benefit from this situation or my coverage of it in any way. And I would respectfully request that anyone making videos about this situation or my coverage of it think carefully before electing to attach third-party sponsorship or opt in for revenue-earning advertisements. But I'm not in charge of you, and I can't accurately evaluate your needs or your intentions. I trust everyone's going to act in good faith to the best of their consciousness, but I ask everyone not to contact or harass Jill or anyone I've criticized unless you have previously established concern with her or that organization. That whistle means it's time for everyone who's still mad at Jill Escher to release the tension with a sing-along so we can have fun and spread the word in a jovial and constructive manner. Let's do it. Don't trust Jill Escher about disability. She's disrespected those with lower support needs, endowed by the public to help their autistic friends, only for her to laugh aloud at actual patients. Jill Escher sure isn't anyone's doctor, but that fact doesn't stop her from publishing discouraging works, targeting autistic people whose diagnosis she calls violently absurd. What a dangerous choice of words. As for my sources, it's funny that you should ask. Everything that I mentioned is from Jill's podcast and her Twitter. Somehow I doubt the evidence will stay up long, but I'd rather give my money to a son. I would rather donate to a son. Mine so long. There, if you're mad at Jill Escher for what she did, sing the silly cartoon dog song instead of contacting her or anyone from the NCSA.